We're blessed to have this opportunity to study this evening, and our beginning passage that we're going to be looking at is in the book of Proverbs in the first chapter. So I hope you have taken that passage and studied it and run references on it. It's a very it's a passage filled with very much meaning and is also just full of wisdom for us to study. The lesson we're looking at is on fearing the Lord, and it's what I believe to be a good outline here that has been prepared, and we'll be looking and studying as far as we can tonight, and then probably finishing up next week in our study. When we look at this particular passage, I want you to notice, first of all, that the passage says that is the beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning of knowledge. There are many things that become attached to the fear of the Lord. Now, when I say become attached, what I mean is, as we take the meaning, we can take that meaning and just sort of let it bloom or let it go in different directions. And then we understand the fear of the Lord even more. There's two kinds of fear, as we'll study in just a few minutes. One is just a timid fear that we might have concerning a spider or snake or darkness or whatever, and then there is the fear of the Lord that brings about a number of things. The fear of the Lord, unless there is this understanding of God and trusting of that of God, many other things that we're going to cover beginning at point B in this section will not mature in our lives as it ought to, because now it's working. Okay. Because the fear has to do with respect and showing that respect, showing that reverence in a right way. Now, for example, in growing up, we didn't like to get a whipping, but we took the whipping and we were corrected by the whipping because we respected our mom and dad. Now, we know that it hurt us and it hurt them, but it was for our good. So when we look at the idea here of fearing God, I want you to see the importance here of a tenderness, of a respect toward that of God that helps us to in our life, as we see here concerning that of Proverbs. It's a useful and a very practical book. And so when we use fear and we have the right kind of fear, that what it produces within us or what comes from us is produced with the right kind of fear. Now, I know that's a long explanation as to what we hope to accomplish in this, but hopefully we can bear that out as we go along. Also, fear is a temperament. Now, when I say a temperament, we see something that might alarm us or scare us. We may shout something, we may jump, we may throw up our hands, we may shudder, we may panic, we could do a lot of things. But when the fear of God is in our life, it's different in the sense that our reverence and our religious reverence, if we want to call it that, is one that, again, is not alarming so much that we're going to run from it. Now, let me make this point here at this particular time. The fear of God draws us to God. It never pushes us away. It never pushes us away. We talk about the day of judgment. It's something we all fear. It's something that the Bible speaks about. It's a day of calamity. It's a day of the end of opportunity. But it shouldn't just cause us to fear that day, but we need to fear that day trusting God. And that changes everything. It changes everything. You know, I've heard people say, and if something were to happen to me, I just couldn't. I don't know how I'd deal with dying. Then I see people who pass away, and they meet it very calmly, and they meet it with a great assurance of their faith. When that happens, this fear of death, which may be just the fear of leaving this world behind, the fear of God is much greater, and that it leads us and pulls us toward that toward that of heaven. Let's look at the section now where it says fear defined. Fear defined. Point number 1. It says the word fear may denote dread, terror, alarm, or fright, that which disquiets or horrifies. This is not the fear the Lord wants us to have. Now, fear is powerful. And when I say fear is powerful, when it comes to dreading something, for example, going to the dentist office, we dread it. I don't know anybody that's got up in the dentist chair and said, "Hey, I'm ready for those shots. Bring them on." That's just not the norm. We don't, and so there is a fear and there is a dread that brings to us, a terror because of the unknown. That's not the kind of fear that the Lord wants us to have. Now, we may have that kind of fear. I about stepped on snakes and frogs and I don't know what all, and you just freeze. I mean, you just yellow jackets. You just if you've been stung 12 times here recently, you're glad they don't jump up off the grass and just get you. So there is the word fear that is coupled in that. But the type of fear that we need to be understanding is the fear that's found in 1 John 4 there in verse 18. And John writes, there is no fear in love. Now we're going to address that a little bit in just a minute. But perfect love rather, casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. The best illustration of this is the fear of losing our soul. We all probably can remember before we become Christians of that fear and that dread. Will we wake up in the morning? Will we make it through the day? If we get in the car, am I going to have a wreck? Am I going to be killed? Or am I going to have a heart attack? Or, whatever might cross our mind. But when we look at fear in 1 John 4 and verse 18, he's saying sort of the opposite. When we have the true love of God, when we have the true fear of God, it casts out this fear. So when it comes to salvation, the fear of losing our soul, there's only one way to remove that fear, and that's to obey God, to become a child of God, and to live faithful to Him the rest of our lives. Now, that's the kind of fear that we need to have, and it casts out or dispels the wrong kind of fear, which shows the dread and the terror and the timidness and so on, that may just horrify us. And so, again, we're looking at fear. Fear is very powerful in the life of a Christian. It changes so many things, our outlook, our disposition. It is a temperament that we need to work on and that we need to have. And that's what we're learning here from Proverbs 1 and verse 7. Now notice further as we go back to the beginning verse. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Now what happens when we hear of the gospel and we're lost. Okay, to submit to that, our consciences must be pricked or cut. Our consciences must be tender, if you will. It must be something that appeals to us. Now, considering that, notice how 1 in verse 7 of Proverbs says, it's the beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning of knowledge. Proper fear, respect, reverence toward God, accepting His word as opposed to the world, is a beginning of knowledge. It's the beginning of understanding that of God. Delmer?
Godly fear, and here's the thing of it is, we know that He will repay all unjust stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If we've lived a wicked life, He's going to repay us. But if we've lived the Christian life, and He forgives us, even though we fear God, we don't fear Him like we did.
Right. Exactly.
You know, being prepared to meet God is something that comforts us.
Right.
And we take courage in it, knowing that He will punish all unjust, sinful things, and know that He will reward us when we live faithful unto Him, even though we fear Him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, John said, when I see Jesus, He fell as a dead man in Revelation chapter 1.
Right.
And I believe I will too.
Yeah. Right. Right. Another good example of that, Delmer, is in Thessalonians, where he talks about how the dead in Christ will rise and will meet the Lord in the air. Mm-hmm. And what does he say there? The last verse in that chapter, I believe it's chapter 4. He doesn't say there, now all you be scared to death when this day comes. He said, no, you comfort one another with these words. That's what you were saying. Good point. Good point. Okay, the other side of the coin in Proverbs 1 and verse 7 is, one, we have a tender conscience toward God. The other is, the fool despises wisdom and instruction. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to listen to it. They do not have a tender conscience toward it. Now, when we look at point B, where he says the fear of God wants us to have toward Him is reverence, awe, respect, and adoration. It's any wonder that the first point that he covers here is love. You shall love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. If you don't first love God, then you're not accomplishing anything. If you don't first love God, there cannot be the proper reverence and awe in your life toward that of God. So when we see then that this beginning of knowledge and the tender heart, look at how we're tying fear now together with love. And we have many sermons on love, and that's all right. Many sermons on love. It's an important part of our temperament and that of our life. But here we're connecting fear with that of love. If you don't first love God, then the fear that you have is the wrong kind of fear. Because you have to love Him, you have to trust Him, and you have love is something that shows that we want to be a part of Him. We adore Him. We reverence Him unlike any other. And we're going to accept Him as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So it is closely linked together with that of love. Now let's look at Matthew 22, verse 37 again. He comes and he says, which is the great commandment? That was the question. He says, you shall love the Lord God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. Your heart, your soul, and your mind. Now that's pretty well the entire of a human being. Can you not love him with your soul? There's a lot of people today, let me rephrase that. There's a lot of people today that in mind they love the Lord. Oh, they'll tell you. They'll tell you they love the Lord, but that's as far as it goes. They don't obey him. They don't do what he says. They don't sacrifice in order to be his child. Everything fits them rather than them being an asset unto that of God. And so that shows the love that we have. If you love me, Jesus says, keep my commandments. It's a show of that love. We cannot show that love. I mean, for example, if there's someone you don't know, you think has wronged you, and whatever the situation may be, let's just leave it at somebody that we really don't know well. We can love them, but we really don't love them because of the closeness that is there. I don't know at the meetings that I've went to, that Pam and I have attended and preached at, that probably there's some that the first time you're there, they're going to make their way through the crowd, and they're going to hug you, and they're going to say hello to you, and they're going to show you they love you. And then some people, it may take to Thursday night. But then they show their love. They show their, I don't know if I grow on them, or I don't know how to explain that. But with God, it's every day, 24 hours a day, the rest of our lives. So Jesus says, with your heart, your soul, and your mind, you are to love God. So our reverence, our respect, our adoration is enhanced because of the love that we have toward God. Look at point number 2. It's closely related to trust. If you don't trust somebody, to be around your house, don't hire them to mow the grass. If you don't trust somebody to work on your car, don't hire them to work on your car. We don't do that, do we? Somebody say, well, they're a crook, and here's how they done me, and here's how they done this, and it's well known they don't work on cars very well, and I just go anyway. You see, that is having respect. They earn our respect. We show trust unto that of God because he protects us. He is our shield, as it says there in Psalms 115 and verse 9. He's our help. He's our shield. And he tells those of the house of Aaron, he says, trust in the Lord. Now, I know that may be a broad statement made to one statement made to a number of people, but it's applicable to every person. And here's why. God, is our help and our strength. Now, verse 11 ties it together. You who fear the Lord, trust the Lord, he is their help and their shield. You see, there's some that God doesn't help. There's some God does help. But he couples it all together there in verse 11 when he says, when you have the proper fear in God, then this proper fear is a trust. You trust in the Lord. That's twice. Once in verse 9 and once in verse 10. Trust the Lord. Now, the reason this trust is so great is that it's never been broken and it's never been betrayed. There's no reason, there's no example where the God's trust has ever betrayed us. He won't. He won't. And I'll go so far as to say he can't. Now, we may betray his trust, but he can't. So, again, let's use our words. Reverence, respect, awe, adoration. This is the kind of fear that we need to have. Trust is because of that. Trust is because of that. They're supposed to have dug up, it's been in the last 100 years, a body in Jerusalem that had been crucified, believed to be the same way Christ was crucified. He was wrapped in this, whatever mummified remains, was wrapped in a linen, and it was put in like a coffin, and they just stumbled up on it in this excavation of and looking for treasures and so on. But immediately some of them assumed, because there was marks where the person had been crucified, that this was Christ. Now, we know, number one, wrong century, wrong time, wrong place, wrong person. We know that. But you wouldn't believe the people that's following that. Now, they trust because there's been pictures that's shown where this person was crucified. But you know, when Jesus was crucified, not long after that, there was a historian named Josephus. And he was Josephus was one of these that was a Gentile at first, and then he was a proselyte into the Jewish religion. And then when the Romans took power, he sort of morphed into the power of the Romans. He was just, sort of whatever at the time. But they was going to crucify his friends. They even started to put them on the cross, and he talked the Roman governors out of crucifying them. They were set free. They were set free. There's no evidence of nails in their hand or in their feet. Now we know if his history is right, these people probably should have been crucified. They wasn't. But we know of a definite assurity that Christ was crucified. That's why we trust him. We don't have to go back and find somebody buried and have no idea how the remains are or how close they were to being crucified and then they were not crucified. We find it all in the Lord. That's why our trust is so strong. That's why our trust is so strong. Now, let's look at point number 3 before we run completely out of time. This kind of reverence should be shown or displayed in our worship and in our coming together. But as for me, the psalmist says, I will come into your house in the multitude of your mercy. In fear of you, I will worship toward you in the holy temple. Now I'm going to come in, we used the wrong meaning of this word, fear. I'm going to come in, I'm going to hide under a seat somewhere because I'm afraid of you, Lord. No. I'm going to come because I know your mercy. You have been merciful to me more than once. You have been merciful to my people. I come into your presence to worship you in spirit and in truth. And notice it says, in the fear of you, with respect toward you. I fear sometimes, and it may be my fault for picking out the wrong songs at the wrong time, but I fear sometimes that we're busy just singing the notes or the words to a song rather than applying it the way we ought to in the idea of worship. Sometimes I think about the lay-by in store. Some people feel they're being fleeced or being robbed when they lay by in store. It's an act of worship. It's because we adore him, we love him, we respect him, we stand in awe of his presence. He, through the inspired writers, gave us these commands. So worship is a time that we need to as well display the right kind of fear. A fear that draws us closer unto that of God. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in one of these really big cathedrals, and New York, Washington, D.C. is filled with them. I'm sure there's some that's closer than that, but on our senior trip we went to, I don't know which one it was, when you walk in there, it looks like the ceilings are 150 foot high. The windows are all decorated. All the sides of the building is decorated, most of them with artifacts, and comes up into a peak. And then the ceiling is not just ceiling lights like these. It's painted in many places. And then you go up and there's like 3 or 4 what I would call altars. You know, we'll go up here on this stage and up here on this stage and up here on this stage. And then whoever the main speaker was, he had this little thing over here on the side that looked like a little balcony, just big enough for him. And he would go over there. Now, all of that's designed to set the mood. To set the mood. When you go in there, they want you to be respectful. They want you to feel that where you're at is different than being out in the world. We need to do that here at McRoberts. Now, we're not going to have an arch ceiling or columns or paintings or anything like that. But we can worship him in an acceptable way, whether it was here or whether it was out there under that tree, whatever, out there in the parking lot. So, what's the difference? The cathedrals and so on is an outward show of man. It's to cause us to come into the presence of something that we fear. Our worship is causes us to have the mindset to come into something we fear, but it's who we love. It's who we trust. It's that of God and who we worship. Point number 4, it is manifested. Fear is manifested in the keeping of the commandments. I mentioned a while ago, if you love me, keep my commandments. The writer of Ecclesiastes says, "Us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man," or this is man's all. Now, look where fear works into that. Fear God and keep his commandments. You respect him enough to do what he says. You stand at awe at him because of his infinite wisdom. You stand in a place where just the awesomeness of knowing that God always has been and always will be should cause us to have this type of fear. Fear God and keep his commandments. That's a wonderful passage that teaches us much about our lives as we serve God, even in the New Testament times. Psalms 14 and verse 9, point number 5, it brings blessings. Here the psalmist says in 34 and verse 9, it says, "Fear the Lord, you his saints. There is no want to those who fear him." You remember we read a while ago, I believe it's Psalms 146 or somewhere there. He is our shield. He is our buckler. That's the same thing. He's our protection. He takes care of us. He's mindful of us. He knows when we're suffering. He knows when we're fighting a battle. He knows when we're worshiping him. He knows when we do his will in helping that of others. Now, let me make one point on point number 5. There is no want to those who fear him. That is spiritual blessings. That's not temporal blessings. Doesn't say you're always going to have food. Doesn't always say you're going to have a new car to drive. It doesn't always say that back in years ago that you're going to have a horse to ride to church. It's directly tied to his children, whom they are fearing God, and there is no want in those who fear him. He will take care of us. Remember the song that we sing. Point number 6. People transgress when they do not possess it. Now, I know there's a big turning point here. We've been looking at all these additions that complements fear. But to say if we don't fear God that it's a transgression, We need to make sure that we understand why those who do not possess the right kind of fear are transgressing. Now in Romans 3, in verses 10 down through 18, I believe it is, this is where Paul quotes some from Psalms and different places. He says, there's none righteous, no, not one. He says from Isaiah, their mouth is an open sepulchre, their tongues is full of deceit, their mouths are, the poison of asps are in their lips, and so on. But I want you to look particularly here at verse 18. There is no fear before the fear of God before their eyes. Now all these things are wrong that we read about here. Feet swift to shed blood. Not being peaceful. Not striving for peace among others. And we could, the cursing and the swearing and so on. He says, of them there is no fear of God before their eyes. That's just as much a wrong as any of the other things that are mentioned here. If we don't fear God, point 7, he makes a very good point. It molds one's character. And the character that we need to have and should have will not be there because we don't fear God. We may be like those in Romans there that Paul addresses. He said there's not even any that seeks after God. We look around us today and you can go any one of our little towns and just look around or if you're there to conduct some business or whatever. People are so unconcerned about God. Unconcerned about God. I can remember one time the editor at Troublesome Times, it was Mr. Daly was his name. It was April Fool. And he come out with this edition of the paper and it found they had found a pink seam of coal over in Knott County. Rare. Oh, he wrote off this article there. Well, put that on the front page. A few minutes, the phone started ringing, and everybody, they found a pink seam of coal. They found a pink seam of coal. No, they didn't find a pink seam of coal. It was April Fool. But no one gets excited when we say, Jesus is coming soon. Nobody rings the phone when we say you're lost unless you obey God. Nobody calls up and says, now, if the sky is a different color, you remember back when the northern lights shine through here? Oh, the Lord's coming. They saw some sort of a light first of the week up the East Coast. They determined it was some kind of a launch space or a space launch or something like that. People were thinking the Lord was coming back. Let me tell you something. This right here says he's coming back, but he's not going to come back with some sort of a sign. We don't know. We just need to fear and respect him. The fear of God is what molds us into the character that we ought to be. Now the last point is point number 8, and it says to be a Christian one must be a God-fearing individual or a God-fearing Christian. He simply says fear God in this particular chapter, this particular verse. Fear God. Let me sort of summarize that for you. If we fear God, we're going to love him, we're going to trust him, we're going to have confidence in him. There are going to be blessings that we will have because we are his children. We have no fear, no timid fear of the grave, or no timid fear of that of the Lord coming again. We don't have those things. But if we obey the commands of the Lord and fear him, then our life is so different. Now I know in this context, Peter was closing out, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. But I'm talking about fear God here only. If we don't have this kind of fear, that we do his will, always seek his will, always live as He wants us to have. Every night, I pray that I have lived the day that I have been blessed with according to His will. If not, I ask for forgiveness and I ask to be made aware of my shortcomings. Now, to mold one's character is to change into what God wants us to be. Not what we want to be, not what the world wants to be. The excitement and the joy that comes from obeying God should be because of our obedience unto Him, and not just because something is unexplained or someone somewhere thinks that the Lord is coming. Our job is not to predict. It's to be ready. It's to be ready when He comes again. We're going to sing our invitation song, and if there's one who has something amiss in your life, or you need to obey the gospel, maybe you don't have the proper fear that you need to have in your life before that of God, we'll be glad to study with you, work with you, help us to understand it even better. Maybe I've said something you don't understand. Give us opportunity. But the fear of God draws us closer and closer to Him. Finally and ultimately, it will take us to heaven. Can we help you as together we stand and while we sing?